Só que agora é o meu nariz, né, que está no... Olá, boa noite. Gente, a última coisinha da escola. Lágrima que corre. Mais uma vez, a gente tem um site do grupo do MTTM. O Thiago vai falar do grupo dele também. A gente tem atividades, né? Também a gente posta as nossas coisinhas no Facebook, na página do grupo. Mas no site, eu tinha, no primeiro dia, né? Eu mostrei. A gente até podia voltar a mostrar, né? No site tem várias das publicações do grupo, então a gente até tem que colocar as coisas novas que a gente ainda não colocou. O pessoal é muito produtivo. Mas eu acho que pelo menos tem um acesso ali a uma bibliografia que pode ser útil para vocês, né? Eu também fiz propaganda do site do Urban Data Brasil, que é outro projeto, né, que eu coordeno, e que tem um acervo bibliográfico incrível. Eu devia ter me programado melhor para deixar um pouquinho para vocês verem também. Mas, enfim, né, vocês estão vendo que é muita coisa para a gente coordenar, né? Mas hoje a gente está muito, né, como falamos para vocês, felizes de ter conseguido finalmente trazer a Mimi Chala, que estava programada para participar da nossa primeira escola e teve problemas de mobilidade, né? May I tell them why you didn't come the first time? Yeah. Ela não atentou para que ela precisava de um visa para o Brasil, um visto, né? Naquele momento não tinha reciprocidade, né? Então tinha reciprocidade. E agora não tem. E ela, né, enfim, no aeroporto de Miami deu conta que não, né? Mas eu vou falar em inglês para ela, né, entender assim. And she was kind enough to be with us remotely the whole event. E agora trazê-la, né? Finalmente, porque depois veio pandemia, né, e tudo mais, e agora a gente poder finalmente trazê-la, tê-la aqui conosco, tá? Vocês já viram quem teve o prazer de acompanhar ontem à tarde, né? No SESC, a atividade, já viu assim, a pessoa querida que ela é, né? Acessível, está muito feliz da maneira como ela está sendo acolhida. Mas, assim, não tem nem como a gente recuperar aqui o tamanho do CV, né? Mas ela é decana da Global School na Worcester Polytechnic Institute. Ela foi professora titular de Sociologia, chefe do Departamento de Sociologia, diretora fundadora do CMOR, né, do Center for Mobility Research. Center for Mobility Research and Policy, da Drexel University, depois que ela voltou para os Estados Unidos. Foi coeditora fundadora da Mobilities, né, que é uma super referência para a gente, um periódico. Cofundadora, aí sim, do Center for Mobilities, né, da Universidade de Lancaster, na Inglaterra, e ex-presidente da International Association for the History of Transport, Traffic and Mobility. Contribuiu diretamente para a criação do paradigma das mobilidades, né, isso a gente já disse algumas vezes, e é essa referência incontornável no campo interdisciplinar, e muito mesmo, né, assim, uma pessoa que pratica muito a interdisciplinaridade. Que é uma marca tão grande, né, dos estudos de mobilidade, e ela também como essa grande especialista em estudos caribenhos. Vários financiamentos de várias instituições internacionais, uma série de publicações, né, uma vasta lista. Tá? E ela é membro honorário do Centro de Estudos Avançados em Mobilidade e Humanidades da Universidade de Pádua. São mais de 150 artigos e capítulos de livro, e é autora ou coeditora de 15 livros. Enquanto a gente fala, já tem outro. I'm saying while I'm speaking, there is another book of yours coming out. How productive you are. So, welcome, Mimi. And Thiago is going to introduce Jenny.
Boa noite. Pois é, último dia, conferência de encerramento em grande estilo,
como tem sido as atividades da SPMob, sem nenhum tipo de, como se diz, de falsa modéstia. A gente comemora, celebra muito a Escola de Mobilidades desde 2017 e tem que ser assim mesmo. Ela só é interessante porque vocês estão aqui, porque a gente pode se encontrar e refletir, pensar juntos sobre mobilidades nas várias conexões possíveis que interessa a cada uma de nós. E é por isso que é super importante poder agora, nessa edição, encontrar com Mimi Scheller e conhecê-la pessoalmente, interagir com as suas ideias, ter a oportunidade de fazer perguntas, e com outras pessoas que aceitaram os nossos convites para estarem em São Paulo nessa semana chuvosa de início de inverno, né? E uma dessas pessoas que aceitaram o nosso convite foi a Jenny Germamotz, que vem também dos Estados Unidos, e é uma dessas figuras, uma dessas pessoas que está enredada nessa trama de produção, de conhecimento, de reflexões sobre mobilidades, compartilhando uma série de referências, de contatos, de ambientes, que vão somando referências para a gente pensar as mobilidades, como temos feito aqui também, né? Vocês tiveram a oportunidade de conhecer tanto a Mimi quanto a Jenny ontem, nesse debate, imagino que uma parte de vocês, falando sobre o olhar do turista 3.0, um livro de referência, né? Agora, existe vida além do olhar do turista 3.0 e cada uma das pessoas que estão aqui desenvolve uma trajetória de pesquisa, né? A Jenny tem uma formação essencialmente em sociologia, socióloga em todos os níveis, e fez o seu doutorado lá em Lancaster, no Reino Unido, tendo a Mimi Scheller como uma das suas orientadoras, né? E logo depois fez um pós-doutorado no, justamente, Center for Mobility Research, que é o famoso SPMob, lá de Lancaster. E hoje atua na College of the Holy Cross, nos Estados Unidos, e trabalham muito próximas. A Jenny e a Mimi trabalham geograficamente, fisicamente muito próximas lá nos Estados Unidos, né? Eu fiz uma colinha só para lembrar algumas áreas que são importantes para a gente saber da trajetória da Jenny, né? Seus interesses de pesquisa incluem, por exemplo, mobilidades e turismo, né? Uma das razões dela estar aqui, e as tecnologias móveis. Tem trabalhado com famílias móveis, viagens educacionais, hospitalidade como uma das áreas de referência, né? E é co-editora de uma importante revista na área de hospitalidade, que é a Hospitality and Society. E tem uma série de publicações que vocês podem consultar depois na página, mas dentre elas, uma das mais recentes, Travel Connections, Technology, Tourism and Togetherness in a Mobile World. A Jenny vai fazer apontamentos sobre a apresentação da Mimi, então ela vai dar destaque ao final da fala da Mimi de alguns pontos que são mais interessantes, justamente porque compartilham de uma origem de reflexão sobre as mobilidades, mas com olhares em alguns momentos diferentes. So, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to come to Brazil and for these comments on Mimi's presentation. Todos nós vamos para lá para assistir a apresentação. There are some housekeeping announcements. Tem algumas informações que eu estava esquecendo. Uma delas tem um QR Code ali. Vocês estão vendo aquele QR Code no cantinho? Se vocês conseguirem posicionar o celular lá, tem uma tradução da apresentação da Mimi, porque ela vai fazer a tradução em inglês, mas vocês podem ter o conteúdo ali traduzido gentilmente pelo Apoena, que também fez o QR Code. Está aqui. Depois eu vou reforçar isso no final, mas a escola acaba hoje, né? Oficialmente acaba hoje, mas os nossos convidados, parte deles continuam aqui, e a Jenny vai oferecer uma conferência amanhã, lá na EASH, na USP Leste, no programa de pós-graduação em turismo, então todo mundo segue convidado. Mas depois eu dou mais detalhes sobre isso antes de a gente encerrar. I was talking about your conference tomorrow at our campus. Thank you so much, Mimi. Thank you.
Tem um QR Code ali também, tá?
Jenny? All of us, we are going there. Yeah. Floor is yours, Mimi.
Okay.
Welcome to São Paulo, finally in person.
Thank you. I'm so happy to finally be here in person. It's wonderful to see you all. Some of you I met last night. Good to see you again. Thank you for coming out. And I hope, how many of you understand some English? I mean, is it Okay, so I'm not totally incomprehensible, but as you heard, there's the translation. Thank you, Apuena, for doing that. Many thanks to USP, to Tiago, to Bianca, and for all of you for inviting me to be here. It's fabulous to finally be in Brazil. So when I heard about the theme of this event of being memory and futures, right? Memorias e futuras, something like that, okay? I wanted to begin by reflecting on some memories of this field of mobilities research and how it began. And I was thinking about January 2004, about 20 years ago. I was working at Lancaster University with John Urry, and we co-organized a conference called Alternative Mobility Futures. And that was part of the launch of CMOR, the Center for Mobilities Research, and we were thinking about topics like the transition beyond cars, right, after automobility, and sustainable cities, sustainability, and decarbonization, right? How could we get people to ride bikes and walk and not have cars be such a problem in the world? We had already published the article called The City and the Car. That came out in 2000. So we had been talking about the city, the urban space, cars, roads, how to change them. And we had also published an article called Mobile Transformations of Public and Private Life. So I was thinking about those things, and at that time we were beginning to co-edit a volume that was published in 2004 called Tourism Mobilities, Places to Play, Places in Play. So tourism was in our thinking, and cars, and cities, and it was after that conference that we co-edited the special issue of a journal, Environment and Planning A, where the introductory article was The New Mobilities Paradigm, and that came out 2006, because we had been thinking from 2000 up to 2006 about how mobilities were a way to think about the world differently, to think sociology differently, geography, urban studies. And then in that 20 years, all of these publications started happening. And these are just a few examples, but we created the journal Mobilities, and then later the journal Transfers I was involved in, and the journal Applied Mobilities came out, and there were different publications, of course, John Urry's book Mobilities, Mobile Lives, Cargo Mobilities, Aero Mobilities, Mobile Technologies of the City. These are just some of the different kinds of topics that mobility scholars were thinking about. And from its beginning, the field of mobilities research was motivated by concerns around, as you see here, differential mobilities, that is, around social justice and social change and social futures. So thinking about the inequality and the injustice in the world, how could sociology help change those things, make a difference? And there were different networks formed around the world. The Cosmobilities Network, the Pan-American Mobilities Network existed for a while. At the very bottom corner, there was a conference called Uneven Mobilities, which was held in Santiago, Chile. And so all of that was how we were thinking. So when I came here to think about memorias e futuras, and I was having these memories, and I thought about 20 years, why are we not closer to sustainable mobilities? And I was thinking of the world at the very moment when I was writing this talk, and there were these giant forest fires burning across Canada, and the smoke was coming down to all the cities where I was, and I come from Philadelphia, I lived in New York. People were choking with masks on because the smoke was so bad. And other forests, of course, are being cut down all around the world, including Brazil, but other places too. And when the ocean ecosystem is collapsing, right, when we know there's mass extinctions happening, when hurricanes and typhoons and intense heat and droughts are coming all around the world every season, when we have a cyclone happening here in Sao Paulo, bringing all this rain in June, and when the carbon dioxide and the other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, they continue increasing, how can we talk about sustainable mobility futures? It seems like we're not getting there. And also, I started thinking about technology and how during the COVID pandemic, everyday mobility and international travel were completely disrupted, and borders have been shut around the world and closed, right, during the pandemic. And we see this drastic effect of the technologies. People switched to flying on private jets, many of them, right? When they couldn't travel, on public airplanes. And also continuing to consume excessive amounts of energy. So what I call the kinetic elite, the wealthy people who fly and travel a lot, they use a lot of energy all the time. And we keep building new roads, new highways all around the world. This system of automobility keeps spreading. And when we talk about futures, so often it's about robotics and AI, ChatGPT, blockchain, and biotech. It's not about sustainable futures, right? None of it is talking about making life more livable for the majority of people. A lot of the imagination of the future is about some technology. So how can we talk about sustainable mobility futures in this world we have now? And far too often, the climate crisis and the sustainability crisis is reduced to a technical question of decarbonization alone. This is an image about carbon capture and storage underground, right? And the whole idea of transition gets focused solely on new technology that's going to help us keep going the way we're going, to keep driving, to keep flying, to keep consuming energy. But we'll do it now, supposedly. We'll capture the carbon and store it, or we'll have electric systems. But the systems of automobility and aeromobility are not just a means of transportation that we can just swap out, have batteries and have electric instead, or biofuel or green hydrogen, and continue business as usual. And technological fixes alone cannot solve the climate crisis, because we would have already done it if it was a question of technology. We've known since the early 2000s, right? Engineers and policymakers have been promoting technical solutions, but it's happening too slowly, right? We're not changing quickly enough. And not only are we not changing, but there's a backlash against the change, right? There's resistance to it. There's those who say we need more fossil fuel and we need more oil drilling, right? And more technology to sort of change where we are. But fossil fuel and automobile dependence are still built into our urban fabric, right? And well, Sao Paulo, my goodness, the cars, the roads, the traffic. Where would you even begin to take it away, right? So we've been arguing for 20 years in this field of mobility studies that the dominant mobility system is an interlocking system of social, ecological practices, of racial regimes of labor and of hierarchy, and also industrial and business networks, and geopolitical and military power. And there's ongoing relations between mobility, energy production, and extractive industries and land use. So it's not just about whether your transportation is fossil fuel or electric, right? It's this complex system that John Arry called the system of automobility. And it's controlled by powerful groups. And there's also hegemonic discourses or cultures about the mobile lives that normalize lifestyles. Like this image makes me think of the British writer Raymond Williams called Mobile Privatization. And you see here this white heteronormative family in their automated car, right? This is in the 1950s, and the idea then was already to have highways and automated cars, but a very dominant view of the kind of family, the gender hierarchy and the racial hierarchy that would be in that kind of family scenario was part of this system of mobile privatization. So we see this embedded into our built spatial forms, but also into our imaginaries, into our imagination of what the future would be. And this kind of infrastructural future that we keep building when we build new highways, when we make new electric vehicles, we're still imagining something like this. So why are these unsustainable forms of life continuing to persist and to spread? So the new mobilities paradigm focused not just on the movements of people and things and vehicles, but on how differential mobilities and immobilities and moorings are interrelated and shaped by unequal power relations. And this was some of my work on the Caribbean region. My earliest work from my PhD was called Democracy After Slavery, Black Publics and Peasant Radicalism in Haiti and Jamaica. And that seems like a very different topic, but that was a study about social justice and democratization and how to make change happen in the world. And later, I studied the Caribbean in Consuming the Caribbean about not just tourism, partly about tourism, but also about how nature and bodies and labor and commodities are consumed by those in the global north. And then Citizenship from Below, which again was about Caribbean freedom and these different ways of imagining where does social change come from and how does change happen? How do you change power relations and the inequality that are embedded in all forms of mobility and dwelling? So I've been interested in linking these problems of sustainable transportation and infrastructure with the questions of social justice, global inequalities, post-colonial politics of power and mobility. And so that's what led to my work on mobility justice, but also my work on aluminium, right, and bauxite mining and extractive industries and how they're related to our mobility systems. And then in Island Futures, how this relates to disasters, natural disasters, and the recovery from climate disasters and the future of small island developing states. So that gives us big sense of all the kinds of topics that come into some of the work I've done on mobilities. And I want to just say that my sense of these dominant mobility regimes is that they're built on these differential systems of infrastructure, of enclosures, of borders, of uneven access to movement, and that control over immobilities and mobilities has deep historical roots in patriarchy, colonialism, imperialism, and racial capitalism. That the way that, if we think of the new world of the Americas, the way it formed was through these uneven mobilities and coerced mobility too, right? And slavery as a system of coerced mobility and coerced immobility. And that is always already implicated in producing and reproducing unequal social relations, unequal subjectivities, and unequal places. So this brings me back to the problem of sustainable mobility futures. And my key argument today, if I just want to sum up, the main thing I want to say is that sustainability and sustainable transitions, green transitions, cannot be viewed simply as a problem of fossil fuels or greenhouse gas that can be met by national commitments or solved with technological solutions or green engineering. This has not worked over the past 20 years, and it will not work over the next 20 years. The only way that we can even begin to imagine sustainable mobility futures is if we attack and uproot the mobility regime that built on social injustice, that built on racial inequality, that built on extractive industries and geopolitical coercion and unequal patterns of consumption and exploitation that are causing ecocide, that are causing the collapse of the entire planetary environment. And that's basically my message today, right, is that we have to understand the deeper histories of the spatial formations of uneven mobilities to analyze the limits of contemporary sustainability transitions, right? We need to go beyond the current imagination of sustainability because it's too focused on just a technical question of decarbonization or electric vehicles or something like that, or even if it's for active transport, bicycling, all those things, it's not enough. A full transition away from the current dominant automobility system will only take place when we address the issues of social inequality that underpin the unsustainability of the current system. We must begin to promote mobility justice as integral to sustainability. And that realization is what kind of shaped all of my subsequent work in this field. So that's part one of my talk, introduction. Now, I'll say a little more in part two, because I want to focus on this idea of mobility justice and think a little more about what we mean by mobility justice. So the concept of mobility justice comes out of this idea that all movement is a political relation. It's kino-political, right? From the Greek root kinein, which means to move, to set in motion, but it also means to change, to stir up. So to move things around is kino. And polis, right? Polis referring to the city, the state, the community, the citizens. All, you bring together that into the word kino-political. And mobility justice highlights how all movement is political and all politics are mobile, right? To have politics, to have a polis, you need a freedom of mobility of people to come together as citizens and have some say in their lives in determining how they are ruled, right? Make their own rules. So mobility justice highlights how all movement is political and that we shape patterns of unequal mobility and immobility in the circulation of people, but also of resources, of information, of cultural meanings and lived experiences through all these different kinds of uneven mobilities. And in broad terms, you could say that mobility justice is a way to frame the entanglements of power and social exclusion in the movement of people, things, ideas, and unequal access to movement or to the ability to move. So climate change in this sense is kinopolitical because it is set in motion, the changing of our climate in the world is set in motion by mobility injustices in terms of who has access to energy, who has access to fossil fuel, who is using up the most of it and benefiting from the existing mobility regime on the one hand, and on the other hand, who is suffering from that climate change that has been stirred up by these other people, right, in ways that affect everyone in the planet and displaces many people from their homes, from their communities, from their livelihoods. So there are these differential relations of mobility that are built into our economy and into global mobility regimes, and it shapes access to social goods, who lives well and has social goods, and who is most vulnerable and who is exposed to the harms of pollution, of climate change, of dying ecosystems, and of ruined livelihoods. And so I think of this as crossing many different scales. And this mobility justice, the book is organized around thinking about bodies and our interpersonal embodied relations with each other, transport systems and how we get around, the whole urban infrastructure space and the space of the city. Also, though, transnational mobility and migration, right? How people move between places. And then in the biggest scale, the global circulation of goods and energy and of the weather itself, the climate itself. So those scales are entangled with each other, and they're constantly informing any relationship we have. So in thinking that way, it brought us to the idea of climate mobilities, and thinking not just about climate change, but climate as a relation of immobilities and mobilities in this movements of people, animals, water, energy, climate risks, and that climate mobilities is not just a question about, we often hear about climate refugees and the fear that all of these people are going to move, but the view of climate mobilities tries to think about that differently and to think about the relational aspect of it and how the privileged movements of some people are codependent on the stigmatized and forbidden movement, migration of the poor, the powerless, and the exploited. So it's not just a question of keeping people out, right, which our borders are built to keep people out, but to recognize that the mobilities that we engage in are affecting other people in the world, and to pay attention to all of these assemblages of relational mobility. So climate-driven causes of migration are entangled with mobility injustices. And across the Americas, we see people fleeing their homes, people driven to cross dangerous jungles like the Darien jungle on the Colombia-Panama border, crossing rivers like the Rio Grande to get from Mexico into the United States. And so often people are drowning in boats in the open oceans, and they're dying in the jungles and in the rivers and in the deserts because of these unjust mobility regimes. This is an image of a Central American family at the U.S. border, a mother with her children being tear gas on the children just trying to cross the border. And there's a dehumanization of people crossing the border. And so many people who are doing this, who are trying to get, say, into the United States in this example, have been displaced because of climate change, because the rural farming economies in Central America collapsed, and because people moved into the cities, and then the cities were violent, and then the political situation was unstable, and then people fled. And so the global north, like the United States, has disrupted the ecologies of Central America and other parts of the world, displaced people, including through extractive industries and mining, also through military action and military political influence, and that's driving these migrations that we see. And yet the kinetic elites who live these lives of high mobility consume fossil fuel, drive climate change, and are affecting the everyday lives of millions of people around the world and in the global south especially. And just so for this image, I'll just say this is, a woman with a name. It's Maria Lila Meza Castro. She's a 39-year-old migrant from Honduras. She's with her 5-year-old twin daughters, Sayira Naleli Mejia Meza and Cheli Nalela Mejia Meza. So, these are people with names, with families, with faces, but they're not treated that way so often. So, we need to fully recognize the ways in which the mobilities of different individuals and groups are bound to those of others and to the non-human environment in complex, multiscalar, and situated ways. And that's an argument from Verlingeri and Schwanen, who make that argument. So mobility justice offers a way to kinopolitically understand these relationships. The relationship between, say myself, okay, I'll say I drive a car. I flew here in an airplane. I live in a single-family home in the suburbs, right? I have a relationship to why these people are having to flee and cross the border like this. And many of us who live in the global north, but in the United States in particular, consume more energy than any other people in the world on a per capita basis. So the push to address climate change through technological solutions has captured the imagination of many North Americans, but it doesn't address the underlying kinopolitical dimension of the climate crisis at all. It says nothing about that. So I can get an electric car, right? So what difference will that make? And in an article I wrote about why the Green New Deal needs mobility justice. Have you heard of the Green New Deal and these ideas, both in Europe and in the US, about kind of making a big state investment in a green transition and new green technologies? And for me, I argued in that work that it's not enough for cities to just have a mobility transition, because it's been found that when cities try to make these investments in, say, like buses and bike lanes and electric vehicles and micromobility, it's been driving what some people call green gentrification. It just makes the city expensive, and for the elite who then feel good because they have good sustainable mobility, while it pushes out the others. And the other argument is that these kinds of green transitions cause climate colonialism. Climate colonialism is when we say, well, we need batteries, we need electric, so we're going to come and mine lithium, and we're going to mine gold and cobalt and bauxite so that we can have a green transition. And we impose all the pollution and all the harm and all the environmental impacts on other places, right? And usually it's in indigenous territories where much mining is happening in the world today. Indigenous territories in Latin America, South America, and in North America and other parts of the world. Or we even say, well, hydropower is good. And of course, here in Brazil, you know about mega dams and the impacts of those in many territories. So all of our ideas about this electric transition if it doesn't address the social inequality, it will cause green gentrification and it will cause climate colonialism. And meanwhile, the prevailing system of automobility still remains dominant worldwide. It still shapes our environment, our cities, and how millions of people move around. So where do we begin to look for truly sustainable mobility futures? And I don't want to just leave you with doom and gloom and make everybody feel bad. So in the last part of the talk, let me try to sketch another way forward, okay? So I'm going to lead towards something more positive. But to make that argument, before I get to that, let me say a little in part 3 about the coloniality of climate. So this is a way to understand the starting point of our current predicament from a much deeper history. Capitalism, colonialism, and slavery changed the climate in the past, and they continue to do so today by creating the gradients, the sort of slope of vulnerability to the consequences of climate change, the uneven impacts of climate change, and the severe harm it causes to the most vulnerable groups. So in the work I've done on the Caribbean, I try to understand how the tropical plantation, right, the settling of the new world, right, the creation of sugar plantations, coffee plantations, gold mines, bauxite mines, and later oil extraction, how that brought all of these things of commodities and energy to the colonizing countries and to the global north, and it masked the labor exploitation that was happening in these faraway places. Our contemporary climate condition is what Caribbean theorist Sylvia Wynter, who's from Jamaica, she names it the interconnected poverty, hunger, habitat, energy, trade, population, atmosphere, waste, resource problem. Okay, one big problem, all connected. And when we better understand the origins of our current unsustainable carbon-based energy culture, it's founded in the system of global slavery and indigenous expropriation of land and attempted genocide and ecocide of peoples, including of Brazil, right? And that contemporary socioecology that's associated with the rise of the industrial world is not just about the use of fossil fuels, but it's about this racialized denial of life, of this sacrifice of the majority of Black, brown, and indigenous people, and relegating those people to what we call the sacrifice zones of extractive industry, to the plantation zones of the world, and to the marginalized urban neighborhoods that are suffering from environmental injustice the most. So the argument that comes out of this kind of work is what Catherine McKittrick and Sylvia Wynter together, they call the human after man. If man is the European Enlightenment figure and the settler and the colonizer, what is the human after that? How can we think of the human beyond man the conqueror, right? Man the explorer. And I draw a little bit on the work of a Colombian anthropologist, Arturo Escobar. I don't know if you know his work called Design for the Pluriverse. And he talks about transformative systemic change requires autonomous thinking based in participatory, bottom-up, situated design from the perspective of diverse bodies and multiple places. And he talks about how today's social and ecological crisis is a crisis of habitability of the Occidental patriarchal capitalist mode of dwelling that has eroded the systemic mode of living based on radical interdependence. So what would radical interdependence look like? How could we imagine a different way of living? And I give just one example here from the movilización de mujeres afrodescendientes por el cuidado, la vida y el territorio ancestral. I didn't say that very well, but it's this Afro-Colombian women's organization and movement. And these are the kinds of movements in many places of the world that are trying to create a different way to live and to be human after man, right? To change that system. And in contrast to that, I'll just show one more slide about migration and the border crisis that's built on racialized fear. And this is the story about the Haitian population who left Haiti after the 2010 earthquake, and they came to work in places in Brazil and in Chile, and they worked here. And then when the COVID pandemic came and there was no work, they were pushed out again. And they headed north, and they crossed Central America, and they tried to come up to the United States. And they got to the border at a place called Del Rio, Texas, in September 2021. And there were 14,000 Haitian people, many with young children, like this man shown crossing the Rio Grande River. And they were forced to camp under a highway overpass. And then the Biden administration deported thousands of these people back to Haiti during a political crisis when the president was assassinated there. And they didn't even get to make an asylum claim. A few people managed to make asylum claims, but most of them were just deported immediately. And right now, U.S. policy in Latin America and the Caribbean violates international law, and it creates these what I call racialized spectacles of exclusion at the border that makes Americans fear, oh, all these people are coming here, all these people are going to flood into our country. And yet it's our policies and our systems that create this border crisis because we don't have good regular methods for migration, for work, for moving freely in this hemisphere. So the dominant mobility regimes also impose immobilities and enclosures of commons, that is, that affect plants and animals and the hydrological system itself. So the mobility regime affects people, but also the movement and flow of water and the release of pollution and the deposition of waste. And all of this interacts to make our environments uninhabitable. And so this coloniality of climate links together questions of human justice with questions also of more than human ethics in regard to ecological transformations that are embedded in our systems. So that leads to an argument for climate justice rooted in what some call abolitionism, right? Like the abolition of slavery. There's an idea circulating now about abolition democracy and abolition climate justice, which is that we need to address racism and climate-induced harm together. And they build on W.E.B. Du Bois, who is an African-American sociologist, who's had this idea of abolition democracy to achieve the unfinished project of Black emancipation in America after the end of slavery, that we need an abolitionist approach to climate justice, which pays attention to historical reparations and intersectional processes that are not just about climate or not just about a sustainability transition, but are also about things like housing, unequal policing, food security, and emphasis on what Ranganathan and Bratman call reparative humanism. And it reminds us that environmental harm often proceeds via dehumanization. And an anti-racist humanist approach to climate embeds narratives of healing from historical trauma and embraces intersectional thinking between these different spheres. And so that brings me to this idea that I get to in my work about mobile, what I call mobile commons, right? Or mobile commoning. And I understand that it's hard to translate the word commons or commoning. Okay, commons. What's a commons? A commons is something that it's not private property, but it's also not public state. It's not public like state property. It's held in between, in common by all of us. And you can think of the natural world as held in common by people and also by animals and plants and things living beings that could move through that. That's a commons, right? And other sociologists and anthropologists have studied this idea of commons in migration, for example, in what are called the migrant caravans. And Papadopoulos and Tsianos talk about this invisible knowledge of mobility, of how to move through transit routes, to find shelter, to cross borders. And they talk about an infrastructure of connectivity. So it's a social infrastructure. And many informal economies, including how to find work or how to engage with a smuggler, to how to cross the border. And that there are also these transnational communities of solidarity groups who provide shelters, non-governmental organizations who offer a politics of care. So instead of the dehumanization that I showed earlier at the border, this is a politics of care as people move together and try to move freely across borders and help each other and support each other. And so this, to me, leads to my conclusion, which is about commoning our futures. So in the violent imposing of this fossil fuel energy culture on the world, numerous private property owners, corporations, and powerful states have enclosed common land and water and the atmosphere itself. They've blocked common passage and movement through the world by other people, but also by plants, by animals. They've poisoned many places with pesticides, with plastic, with mining, with radiation. And these processes continue today. They're being extended to the deep sea, where we're drilling oil, right off of Guyana, for example. The largest oil fields in the world have been discovered. Even to the moon, right? Why does Elon Musk want to build a big rocket to go to the moon? Not just for tourism. They want to mine the moon, right? They'll mine anywhere they can. But all of this is being fiercely contested in ways that go beyond finding technical solutions to green energy transitions, and a politics that is about more than decarbonization or electrification. The countries that have been the largest contributors of greenhouse gas emissions cannot just keep extracting more for their green transitions. And if we just keep putting more renewable energy into our power grids, there's a paradox that happens, which is called the Jevons paradox, which is that we end up using more energy. So, for example, the United States has put a lot of solar energy and wind power onto our grid. And guess what we're using a lot of it for? For Bitcoin mining. Bitcoin mining is taking tons of renewable energy. Many, many megawatts of renewable energy is going to this useless production of cryptocurrency, right? And so the same goes with the electric vehicles that are most popular in the United States are big trucks, right? So a big electric truck needs a big battery. They weigh like 3 tons or 4 tons, these trucks. They're very, very heavy. And so we take renewable energy and batteries and we paradoxically use it for big trucks, okay? So this kind of green or supposedly green development just extends the environmental injustices and the colonial legacies through the kind of extractive industry it requires. And it's not actually getting us any further. We'll just consume increasing amounts of energy. So I've been arguing that a deeper transformation must be grounded in this pluriversal politics of mobility justice that challenges the uneven kino-political relations that have created the current environmental crisis. And we must reclaim mobile commoning through an ethics of care that requires careful relation making and acknowledges feminist, indigenous, Black, and other marginalized groups' knowledge, labor, and living places. And there's a wonderful feminist theorist named Silvia Federici, and she has a book called Feminism and the Politics of the Commons in an Era of Primitive Accumulation. And she teaches us that not only that the commons have not vanished, but new forms of social cooperation are constantly being produced. There are always new forms of social cooperation, of care for others, that are always being produced. And that we need to reach across these boundaries and acknowledge the other ways of being and becoming that are beyond the narrow concept of, modern man separate from nature and the modern science and the modern forms of technical knowledge, that all those things that have broken our relationalities with others. So there's groups, for example, in the United States called People for Mobility Justice, and they have principles of mobility justice where they say historical disenfranchisement, disinvestment, exposure to pollution, and repressive policing of communities of color negatively impact our collective health, wealth, mobility, and security. Mobility justice, they say, demands that we fully excavate, recognize, and reconcile the historical and current injustices experienced by communities of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and women, and other marginalized groups. And that's where we need to begin our fight for a sustainable mobility future. So finally, I'll say that abolition decarbonization must consider how we can prevent what I called low-carbon gentrification in our cities, as well as climate colonialism and extractive sacrifice zones. We must transform the local embodied interactions of public space and streets and transit, yes, but also regional patterns of land use and ownership by recovering the mobile commons. And we need to transform the transnational relations of resource extraction and energy circulation that underpin these large-scale infrastructural transitions. So we need not only a shift to non-carbon fuels and electric infrastructure, but a critical stance involving more socially just forms of life, new material assemblages of mobilities, more equitable distribution of energy, of public transit, of land, of food, of water, of housing. In short, we need mobility justice. So finally, the conclusion I would argue for is that we need to recognize the racialized harm and ongoing mobility inequities in the world today. We need infrastructural reparations, and that the global north must pay a climate debt to the places that have been harmed by climate change. And we need to shift planning power away from the kinetic elites who control urban planning and transport planning through the democratization and decolonization of local and global decision-making. We also need to restrain and limit the overconsumption of energy and of excessive travel, right? Hypermobility. We need to create rules for commoning, meaning for sharing and caring mobilities, where we limit ourselves and where we take care of others. And we need to reduce the harm, the inequity, and the injustices through what I've called mobile commoning. And I'll end there. I hope you understood some of that talk, or as much as you could, and I would love to discuss with you and hear your questions about any of the ideas. So thank you for listening. Sorry to spring this on you. Yes.
Is that, can everyone hear me? Okay. All right. Thank you, Mimi. So hi, I'm Jenny Gurman-Moles, and I'll keep my comments fairly short because I'm sure you all have much more interesting questions to pose to Mimi. But I just want to thank you for that amazing talk. Mimi started off the talk by remembering a conference in January 2004 that was held at Lancaster University, the Alternative Mobility Futures. And I was a PhD student at Lancaster at the time, and I was a helper at the conference. So to all of you helpers for the SPMob, keep at it, because these conferences are just such important, amazing catalysts. And as Tiago mentioned, Mimi was my PhD supervisor and my professor for my colloquium class, and I have never stopped learning from her. Even just sitting in the audience tonight, I'm like, oh, you should see how many notes I have, but I won't go through all of them. So I hope you all, I think you all know how lucky you are to be in the audience today. I just wanted to maybe draw out a few themes or points that I thought were quite salient before we hear from the audience. So I think one of the first things that Mimi really emphasized here, and that I think sometimes gets lost in some of the applications of mobility studies, is the extent to which the mobilities paradigm from the very beginning was always a critical paradigm, right? Power, inequality, social differentials, immobilities and mobilities has always been really at the crux of this paradigm. This idea that all movement is a political relation or is about power is something that's never far from my mind, and I think can always kind of bring us back to why we do this work that we do. The other thing that I was thinking about quite a bit as Mimi was talking about these different possible futures that we seem to be investing in, and how we seem to be investing in this kind of technological future. And, you know, I was ready for my Jetsons flying car a long time ago, and why isn't it here, right? If we are so smart, versus a future where we are making life livable for everyone. And I was thinking about this because I've been revisiting one of John Urey's later books, one of the last books he published, called What is the Future? And in that book, he really is making a call for social scientists and for sociologists to reclaim their part in imagining the future. And he kind of takes us to task a little bit and says, we've kind of left this job to the technical folks, to Silicon Valley, to the think tanks, to the corporations, to the military. Believe me, they are all thinking about the future, right? Where are the social scientists? Where are the social scientists in those conversations? And listening to Mimi's talk reminds me why it is so incredibly important to have that sociological perspective in imagining these futures. Because as we heard tonight, Mimi is able to unpack the historical legacies that got us where we are, but also to draw on all of these interdisciplinary theories and engagement with activist groups and some of the amazing groups, community organizing and solidarity groups that she mentioned toward the end, to wrap all of that into imagining a livable future for everyone. And so I think I'm thinking more and more now about John's call for us to be part of that conversation about imagining the future, which scares me to death because I'm not good at forecasting anything. But I understand that, and And Mimi's given us a way to, I think, follow that agenda. And then the last thing I want to mention is I really like this idea about kinopolitics and this idea of things getting stirred up, right? And who benefits and who suffers when things get stirred up, right? When there's uncertainty, when there's turbulence. And this idea that we are all in the stirred upness together and figuring out how to live together in this on this planet that is stirred up. And so I think this idea of conviviality is really important here, right? How do we live together? Today, Tiago took us on a tour of a building where there's a lot of residents in the building, and they're all using the building in very different ways and for different purposes, some sort of illicit ways and some more formal ways. And so there's a lot of tension about like who should be allowed to wear what on the elevator and things like that. And it reminds me of how messy this human togetherness thing is, and awkward and uncomfortable and beautiful and wonderful and necessary. And so that was sort of the message I was getting here. And it reminded me of some work I've been reading in environmental science and affect and emotion. I've been reading a book by Sarah Jaquette Ray, who's an environmental scientist at the University of California at Humboldt, and she talks in very similar ways about all of these problems being completely interconnected. So it's not just about climate solutions, but it's climate, racial justice, gender justice, sexual justice, housing justice, geopolitical justice, indigenous rights and knowledges, and also caring for our non-human compatriots in the world, and this kind of intersectional thinking that we have to have. And as I was reading this book with my students, we were getting overwhelmed. I mean, that's a very long list of hyphenated problems, right? And we were getting feeling very overwhelmed. And then we sort of thought, well, if it's everything, then anything we do will be part of moving towards sustainable futures, right? We don't have to do it all, but if we can sort of start making our way into these problems through from where we are or through what makes sense for us. And Sarah Jaquette Ray has this concept of critical hope. And I think that's kind of what Mimi left us with tonight, is this idea of critical hope, which is the idea that, yes, it's hard work. Like, it's really hard work, and it's worth it. Right, it's the kind of hard work that is worth it. And so I think that this idea of recovering the mobile commons is it's hard work. And it's really scary for an introvert like me to understand that the solution is to be in social relation with people. So so it does worry me a little bit, but I find it also very inspiring, in kind of like in between inspiring and provocative, right? So thank you, Mimi, for these thoughts. It's wonderful. Thank you so much. Can't wait to hear the questions. Stay here with me. Okay.
Okay, so how should we do questions? Do we need a translator if people want to ask in Portuguese and then you can translate?
Não, o pessoal pode falar em português, tá? A gente ajuda.
Kevin.
Ok.
Só é bom você ir lá por causa da gravação para falar no microfone. Maybe
just turn it that way.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Can you all hear me? Okay, so thank you for coming here to the University of São Paulo. I have a question, but also before that, I'm going to tell a short story, because one of these days I was talking with a friend from high school, and we are talking about having a car. And I don't have a car. I never had one, and I think it's a kind of expensive to keep and to buy a car, so I never really thought about having one. But my friend was talking about wanting one, because he was talking like how difficult it is for people from the peripheral zones, from the outskirts of the city, to travel, to have mobility within the city. And we both are from outskirts of the city, so we were talking about that. And then he told me that, and I started to think that having a car is not only, how can I say, it's a privilege to have a car, but it's also a privilege not to have a car. Because when you don't have a car, it means you probably live close to the city, you have easy access to your places, to study, to job, to work, etc. So I wanted to ask both of you, how do you think we can address the issue to people? How can we address then the importance of having the sustainability of mobilities, since we have to take in consideration all the difficulties for people to abandon their old habits, like stopping driving and taking public transportation when we don't have a good public transportation in the city. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So, such a really important question, and it comes up all the time, because what happens sometimes is when people who think of themselves as environmentalists preach, oh, we shouldn't have no cars, like everybody should be biking and walking and on the bus. Not everybody has access to that, like you said. And that's why it's so important to look at the spatial structure of the city and the way it's built in relation to class and race and gender and people's disabilities, that the environment kind of makes it difficult for them to do those good mobilities. And that then makes people negative towards the environmentalists who are calling for that, right? Because it ignores their actual lived experience. And so groups like the Untokening and People for Mobility Justice, they say you have to begin from people's lives and experience and their own knowledge of their needs, their safety, their sense of how they might have access to things. And so it's not always about telling people they shouldn't drive a car. And really, when you look in the big scheme of things, that if you have the top 10% of energy users, if that most excessive consumers of energy brought their consumption just down to the middle, we would cut about 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. And so the idea that this little poor person down here who needs a car to get to work is having any impact on the climate is nonsensical. They're not. And so why should we tell that person, no, you can't have a car? So maybe that's the wrong way to go about it, right? What would be nice is if there was an affordable car, a car that didn't have tons of air pollution, that made it poor effect on people's health and their lungs. I mean, would be nice if we had better public transportation to all these places also, but it can't simply be to scold people for driving and to feel virtuous because you don't drive a car because you're rich enough to live somewhere where you don't have to.
Hello.
Hello, Apuena.
First, I wanted to say thank you for coming to Brazil, to our event. It's really nice to have you here. And I wanted to share that when I was reading, I agree with what Professor Jenny said about the mobilities paradigm is always about immobilities as well. But when I was reading your book, it was really good to see that you were using the words that are so important to us, like racism and patriarchy and gender differences and inequalities and etc. So I was really celebrating your words when I was reading your book. And I don't know, the last time I was that happy while I was reading or learning about something, it was when I was, I don't know, reading Bianca's word, or when I was at the SPMobilities for the first time. So it was really something really great for me. So thank you for your work.
Thank you.
And I wanted to make some school questions, as this is a school. I wanted to bring some subjects that we were discussing on the last days. And the first question, I wanted you to talk more about scale. Because, for example, when you think about the pandemic, we had this microscopic virus that was causing like global disruptions. And in the middle of all of that, we had, I don't know, in Brazil, a lot of people were talking about stay home and staying at home, while a lot of people were working and, in some sense, enabling the people that were staying home. And we had a lot of mobilizations. So we have a lot of different interactions and a lot of things happening, like policies that were not directed to some people and directed to other people. So I think your work really helps me to think about scales, but I wanted to explore a little bit of more of what you mentioned during your presentation of scales. And the second aspect is infrastructures and moorings, mainly because of Bianca's presentation, she was talking about how the mooring is something important for us to kind of territorialize and specialize, like to think about space when you're thinking about mobilities. But I think there is some confusion to when we're thinking about infrastructure and when we can define some infrastructures as a mooring. So, I don't know, someone can be a mooring or someone can be an infrastructure. So, and one last thing about this second aspect. Also, during the pandemic, a lot of people were organizing themselves or interacting through like the digital infrastructure, so like WhatsApp or, I don't know, Facebook and whatever. So can we think about these digital spaces or digital infrastructures as moorings? Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And feel free to jump in on any questions. Do you have any thoughts on the digital side of that? I'm asking Jenny to help answer.
Sure, yeah, what an amazing question. And I love the question about scales, because that's something I find really useful in Mimi's work as well, is thinking across those scales, not just as if things are happening at different scales, but also the way we talk about them and the way we engage with those things create those scales, right, as well. But the idea of the digital mooring is, I think, absolutely a really wonderful way of applying that concept to think about mooring. I think we often think about mooring as very tangible, like infrastructures. But I also think of it not just as the thing that like pins us down, but also the place from which we're able to also move, right? So the digital is those digital spaces, especially the way we were using them during the pandemic when we felt stuck. It was sort of that way of unsticking ourselves.
Yeah, and I think so. Originally, when we first wrote the piece with Kevin Hannum and myself and John called Mobilities, Immobilities, and Moorings, that was the first time we started using the term moorings. And we were thinking about it in that piece as something to do with like the built environment, right? The built infrastructure. And that like to have mobility, you need like say a highway, or you need a bridge, or you need there's something that channels it. And so those things get kind of built into our urban fabric. But also to then say, okay, if mobilities need these spatial structures or moorings, the spatial structures themselves are also mobile. They're always changing. Like the city is always changing. The buildings are changing. The highways are changing. So the things that we think of as like fixed are temporary. And that's why we called them moorings, not structures, because we wanted to be able to think of them as moving a little bit sometimes, maybe more slowly, and that the things that are moving also require all of these fixed supports also. And then later, Tim Cresswell wrote about friction, and that to move, you actually need a certain amount of friction, right? Like you have a rubber tire on the road because it gives you the right friction to be able to roll well, right? And so immobility and mobility are related, but also like friction or moorings are part of mobilities. And there was a lot of theoretical effort also about thinking, people like David Bissell, thinking about waiting and like stillness. And that in stillness, there's still a kind of movement. And there's different ways of thinking about imaginative mobilities, anticipated mobilities, resting as a moment of mobility. People did a lot of work also looking at benches, like where you're in a station or a park, but there's a bench and you pause and you wait and you watch, but it's still a kind of space of some mobility. So just all of those terms were ways to like break down the dichotomous thinking, like, oh, either you're moving or you're staying still, and to say, actually, they're always in this kind of relation that's sort of blurry or that's mixed. It's a mix of the two terms that are happening together. So that was why the idea of moorings was helpful, because if you think about boats, which is where the word mooring often is associated with boats, is it's in the sea, right? And the sea is always moving, and the mooring itself is moving up and down with the tide, and you tie the boat on, and the boat is still moving even when it's moored. And so it was just a way to, again, to shake up our idea of what's stable and still and fixed and what's moving, and to say it's more complex in relation to each other. So the pandemic and the digital infrastructures, I mean, I think that's a great example to think about that. So like when we thought about initially, the pandemic seemed like it was stopping mobility. Like everybody would stay home and nobody would go out and people felt stuck in place. But then we quickly saw that workers had to keep moving and that they had to put themselves at risk, right, to move around. And that what the pandemic actually did is it just changed around who was moving and what was moving. So it demobilized and it also remobilized, right, in different ways. And again, it means to be more thoughtful about the sort of mixture of power in moving and not moving that's always there. And one of the greatest powers of what we call mobility capital is that not just that you're able to move in many different ways, but that you're able to bring things to you, to have things brought to you, to have deliveries brought to you, that you get to stay still if you're rich enough and safe enough and secure enough, and others have to move around to bring you things. And so that's another way to think about that question of moorings, and that the digital infrastructure is closely related to that kind of mobility capital. So the digital infrastructure gives the kinetic elite the power to call things towards them and to mobilize other people, others' labor, and other things towards them. So digital infrastructure is about partly like social connections, but it's also this way of literally making physical connections at a distance, right, digitally, that requires others to make the physical connection to get those things to you. Yeah, I think that's my thoughts on that question. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hello. Good night, everyone. My name is Victoria. I'm from EASUSP, is the campus that you are going to be tomorrow. So I have a lot of things to talk to say, because it was a great experience to be here tonight. I came here like to listen about green stuffs. And we all know about like the fight between cities and forests, and the technology and green stuffs. But when you talk about like the freedom of mobility and like all the issues that we have, I like this. There was a big boost for me to start study and start searching more about it. So thank you so much for being here tonight. Thank you for, organization and stuff like this. So I was thinking more about it, and like my mom always say, like when we watch merchandising, like the talk about, oh, this bottle is 100% recycled. My mom says, okay, this is like 2050. They are so ahead. They're so far away from us. They're thinking huge. But it's just marketing, And when we talk about more about it, it's really deep. It's really deeper. So my question is actually for both of you. What encouraged you to start studying and keep talking and keep working about it? Because it's a deep topic. Like everyone needs to listen, needs to talk about it, needs to debate something like this. So, like when we talk about social and ecological crisis, is a crisis of ability that you talk it. It's really, really sensitive. It's how can I say this? It's really fragile to talk about it. It's a really top. It's good to talk about it, So I'm gonna ask you today and tomorrow maybe. What encouraged you? What was the first thing that you find attractive to study and keep searching about it? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just say I'm glad you mentioned your mother, right? Because, as an academic, right, we're encouraged to be very academic, right? We read books and we talk about theorists and we have ideas and all this intellectual university stuff. But what keeps us going, like what commitments are really important, sometimes comes from our mothers, right? Who are not the academics and not the university. But if you have a mother, or maybe it's another family member, maybe it's a father too, whose life teaches you lessons and who's in maybe in a different life situation, not in a university, that's in touch with like the real, right? And those struggles of real people in real situations and problems, facing the problems of the world, are what keep me going and what make me feel this commitment to social justice, because my mother was committed to social justice and my mother spent her life fighting for social justice causes, and not as an intellectual or academic, but as someone out marching or protesting, supporting different organizations, volunteering, doing all kinds of things, helping children. She's a teacher, a social worker, all of that. Like, that's where the commitment for me comes from.
Follow that. Okay, I'm going to go the opposite direction, actually, and say that I think what keeps me going is like my students. Honestly, not that I'm their mom, but and I teach sociology classes, and I teach undergraduate students. And recently I've been teaching first-year undergraduate students. And so the opportunity to introduce them to something like the sociological imagination or a sociological way of thinking can be very, very eye-opening for students, because in the U.S. you don't study sociology in high school. You only learn it when you come to college. And I guess I have this little calculus, like if I can get through to like 2% of my students and they can go out into the world and bring, this sort of these sociological insights to their work, maybe that will have some kind of knock-on effect as well. So very inspired by my students and by my mom.
You.
And by my mom too. And yeah, by you all. And by my teachers too. Do you have a question, Maurice?
Hi, thank you so much for your conference, and my question is for both of you. It's about a little bit about sociological imagination and the relational character of mobility's framework. When you have this critical and skeptical view of green transition through technological solutions, and this whole technophilia, we can call this way, you bring this relational view and about how things are related in systems and global systems that involve people and things, material objects and ideas and signs, images, everything. And the mobility's approach is always about bringing this heterogeneity of how things are related. It's different when people in their research methods, they just focus in, I'm studying objects, I'm studying people, or I'm studying signs or texts. Mobility researchers, they normally study the intersected mobilities, and we use a lot of words for this, John used NU assemblages, intersected mobilities, hybrid systems, complex systems, entanglements, and so on. So my question is, and also when you say the rich global north has to look about the consequences of their lifestyles on the global south, and always looking about also the relationship between the tourists and the service workers, the interactions, and the systemic consequences of everything. So my question, I don't know how to put it, but do you agree that this relational thinking is sort of essential to mobility's approach and involves putting together people and things and ideas and signs?
Yes, I think that's a great question. Yeah. You put that very well. What's your name? Mauricio. Okay. Yeah, that's very perceptive view of it, and I think you're right that that is part of what makes it different than other disciplines or methods that purify the thing they work on. And part of the history of disciplines was that they divided themselves up. Anthropologists will take this, and geographers will take space, and sociologists will take, the modern world, and literature, we'll just do literature. And the mobilities we described it as post-disciplinary, because it tries to bring all of those things back together, in a sense. And some people criticize it for that, right? Some people feel like, oh, well, it's doing a little bit of everything and doing nothing well, right? Like
all of us we heard.
Dabbling. Yeah. Right. But for me, that just made more sense, right? Like the world is complex and entangled. So why would we not study the complexity and the entanglements and the things you said, assemblages, constellations, hybrids, because it gives you a better understanding of how it's working. And mobility's theory or approaches became a way for us to do that. And for me, it freed my work from being pinned down to just one thing or another thing, right? And said, actually, it's okay to think widely across these different domains and different topics and areas. And I think, for me, I mean, where did that originate from was that I come from Philadelphia in the United States, and Philadelphia was the one of the origin points of the American Revolution, right? And the ideas of liberty, freedom, democracy, like Philadelphia played a big part in that history. And it always taught us when we were children, taught us about that history as a very like linear progress, like we have the American Revolution, and then we have democracy, and then we have freedom and justice for all, and that it was always going to get wider and better. And I started to understand that the more I studied that history, that's like a local history, beginning with my own personal experiences of what I saw around me, which is I saw inequality and segregation and poverty and things like that. I realized that the story of my place in the world was this big story of the transatlantic world that includes Brazil, that includes the Caribbean, that includes Africa, that includes all of these other places, and the Pacific too comes into it, right? And that just to tell my own story, I needed to understand that bigger world. And that, I think, was probably, when I was a kid, that was the starting point that probably led me towards this view.
Yeah, I mean, that's the sociological imagination, right? And it's so interesting. Mimi said she felt thinking relationally and thinking about mobilities freed her work. And when Tiago and I were talking a few weeks ago in preparation for this visit, I said the exact same thing to him. I said the mobilities paradigm freed me from tourism. We'll talk about that tomorrow. But yeah, there's just something. I think this idea of looking at relationality, assemblages, hybrids, that's the powerful story, right? That's where the generative part of it is, or the vitality of it, the way you write about live sociology, right, is in those relations. That's where the stuff is happening. So I agree. It's a really nice way to characterize the field.
I have a question. It's very simple or not. Thanks, first of all, for our conference, Mimi, and again for being here with us and being so open for discussion with your heart in this moment. I was reading for the second from the bottom, item, which is create rules for commoning, sharing, and caring mobilities. I'd like to hear, if you can, both of you actually, more about care as a complex category. Because I was thinking on hospitality, and in general, hospitality brings us the idea of a shelter, which is something in general fixed. So the house or something you can go underneath and to be protected. And how to think about care as a complex concept when you're talking about these several scales and spaces and processes of mobilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. It's a good question, complicated question. So I think for me the ideas about care came partly out of reading feminist work and partly out of reading indigenous critical thinking, which is growing recently, a lot of it. And so from the feminist work was the idea of that labor, there's labor, paid labor, and then there's like reproductive labor that's often unpaid. And reproductive labor is taking care of children, taking care of elders, taking care of partners, taking care of the household, and all of this work that women do. And much of that happens in a mobile way also. And so work that was done on gender and gendered mobilities, like the work of like Paula Giron, right, in Chile, talked about how women were often making journeys caring for others, right? So their mobilities were mobilities of care. And so I think that had gotten me started thinking about care. And then reading critical indigenous studies, there's a lot of work that's done on, it kind of begins from the concept that people think about 7 generations into the future in a lot of Native American cultures. 7 generations. And so what your actions are now are being done thinking towards care that far into the future that you'll leave the world, you know, for the future generations. And so it's a kind of temporal care that's much longer than some of our more individualistic, self-serving kind of, at least in North American style thinking. We don't often think 7 generations in the future. And so what does it mean to move through the world caring for others and caring for futures? And in the critical indigenous thinking also, there's not a separation between humans and nature. Like, it's more that people come from the place and from seeds and from forests and from water, and that it's interconnected. And so there's a care for the world that is present in how people even think of what they are. What is a person is caught up with a care for the place that we've come from and are part of, and our future generations will be part of. So it's those 2 currents, I think, brought me to that concept of care. Want to say anything about hospitality?
Yeah, so I think I've, come. Well, I don't actually write about care very much, but I can talk about it because I come from it from a similar set of feminist work around care, transnational care, and Arlie Hochschild's work on global commodity chains, but global care chains, right? And so talking about a lot of the women who travel to be nannies or au pairs or to leave their own children in one place in order to care for other people's children in another place, and how care kind of circulates as a commodity, but also how those global care chains disrupt performances of hosting and guesting, right? So is an au pair a host or a guest, right? And so it kind of that makes us think about who is taking care of whom and who merits care, right? Who merits being cared for. And so in hospitality too, we think a little bit about some of the philosophers who inspire hospitality, critical hospitality thinking, like Derrida or Levinas, and this idea of responsibility. So not like responsibility for each other, but responsibility, the ability to respond to the other. And so it becomes this ethic of how we be with. Sorry, my English has to get kind of funny here to talk about these ideas, but Levinas talks about this idea of being with is an ethic of care, or should be, right? Isn't always. So.
I just have a question also. you for your talk. It was very interesting, very stimulating. I just have a question regarding the role of the state, because I think here is, I don't know if it's a kind of missing link, but where is the role of the state on your perspective, the welfare state? So it's possible, for instance, to create rules for commoning, sharing and caring mobilities without think about policies, social policies that came out from the state. Also, the role of the state and welfare state, for me, it's very important because it brings also, it's also a source of solidarity, of the sense of community and so on. So, well, the question is, in your frame vision, what is the role of states and basically the welfare state in this?
That's a very good question. Well, so let me begin by saying that the model of the welfare state has, in the U.S. context, has been so emaciated, so withered away. There's such attack on the state constantly from the sort of Trump side of things, from the Tea Party, from the libertarians, a sense of that the state is always being cut back, right? And so I feel in some ways that the idea of solidarity and community has been brought back to a much more local level, like within communities, within localities, within towns, or even within in states, like the 50 states, right? That there's more of a sense of people actually working together towards some form of social policy. Maybe it's because the Congress is so gridlocked, it's impossible to have sort of social policies at that level. So I have to admit that in the U.S. context, debates over the welfare state are just gone. They're non-existent, which is a terrible thing to say, right? I think in the European context and probably Latin American context, it's very different politically in terms of the positions around that. But where it's still, the one place where it still exists in the U.S. is the question of funding for public transportation. Right. And so if we're going to have public transportation systems, they're only going to work if they get public funding. And that's one of the few places where people kind of accept the idea of a role for the state in publicly funding transportation. Even public housing, we barely have any investment in public housing anymore, except in certain states where there's starting to be some investment. So it's I guess that's a very unique U.S. aspect of thinking about the welfare state in relation to mobilities. And I would be interested to hear more about, in European context or in Latin American context, is there a different way forward to think about what is held in common and whether the state can be part of that kind of common good and common space and common... I mean, I'm very struck here in Sao Paulo, more of a civic commons, right? There's more places where people of many different kinds are passing and interacting and with each other. And in the US, because so many people are living spatially segregated lives and commuting in cars, apart from New York City or something, there's very much less of a civic commons left in a lot of our big cities.
Gente, mais uma pergunta para a gente encerrar? Acho que é isso, né? Acho que parece que querem fazer ali perguntas. Não sei. Alguém tem uma pergunta em português, gente? A gente traduz.
Diga, Mariana.
Vamos lá, Mariana.
Mariana quer.
Olá, eu vou falar em português. Eu, na verdade, não tenho pergunta, mas eu queria agradecer, né, por mim, acho que por todos. A fala de vocês foi muito inspiradora, mexeu muito, e o que mexeu muito comigo, principalmente, foi nessa última parte, falando sobre caring, né, sobre cuidar. Eu, vou falar da minha experiência individual, eu como mãe acadêmica, né, me movimentar academicamente, eu acho que isso, não só para mim, mesmo sendo uma experiência individual, mas não só para mim, me movimentar academicamente também é um ato de cuidado, né? Não só para mim, mas para quem eu vou deixar, né? Para quem eu vou cuidar e como eu vou levar esse cuidado e como meu filho vai levar para frente. Eu acho que isso se relaciona com a experiência de muitas mulheres no Brasil, principalmente as mulheres racializadas, e em experiências, né, em quilombos ou em aldeias onde o cuidado ele é coletivo, né? O cuidar ele é realmente um ato político, né? De afeto, de continuidade, de futuro. Falar disso dentro da academia, que é um espaço tão hostil muitas vezes, é um respiro e traz muita esperança, né, para os nossos próximos trabalhos e como a gente pode levar isso, né, para as próximas pessoas, tanto dentro da academia, mas principalmente como isso vai se transformar fora dela. Então, muito obrigada a vocês. E é isso, eu espero que, agora mais uma vez individualmente, que meus próximos trabalhos reflitam tudo isso que foi discutido nesses últimos dias, a partir de todas essas inspirações. Agora, vocês traduzirem.
Okay, let me try and make you justice, right? So Mariana is a MA student. She has a 3-year-old little boy. And now I'm moved too. And she's saying that it was very inspirational, so she's very grateful, as all of us. And she was especially moved when you both were saying how care is relevant and how political it is, and that she's moving herself and how hard it is to move and keep going when you have someone that you're responsible for, and that you do that also because you are responsible for that one. Mm-hmm. And that she is inspired by her own topic of research, because she's researching this Quilombola community that is an African Brazilian resistance, and where care is collective, it's a collective matter, and and that how important it is to be here, to be part of it. And then she hopes that this is going to impact her own way of researching. And as her advisor, I am grateful for that too. So thank you.
Oh.
Yeah.
Thank you. Wow, I just want to say thank you for sharing that with all of us. And that, I mean, just the emotion that goes into the kind of care that you're describing, how challenging it is for you to be in the university, right? To move around, to be mobile physically and socially. That collective forms of care would make so much easier. That for all of us who are carers, if we did it collectively, that would be a kind of what I'm calling mobile commoning, because it would allow us to be more free and to care for others together. So that's a beautiful example you gave, so thank you.
Yay!
Good point to stop. Yes.
Just to finish.
Yeah.
Bom, gente, é isso, né? É sobre isso. É sobre isso essa SPMob. Hã?
Ela estava só dizendo que foi o melhor público que ela já encontrou.
É sobre isso. E aí, assim, a gente vai encerrando essa etapa com essas maravilhas, né? Essas manifestações de afeto, beleza, vontade, inspiração, desejo, força e todas as outras coisas bonitas que a academia pode proporcionar, né? Então, a gente não pode esquecer disso. A gente tem que cultivar essas coisas e cultivar bem, né? Celebrá-las sempre que possível e collectively, né? Commonly. E a gente precisa ir encerrando. Eu queria mais uma vez, obviamente, agradecer a Mimi. Thank you so much again. Thank you, Jeannie, again, for being here, you both. É difícil fechar uma conferência como essa, difícil fechar uma escola, né? Mas eu acho que todas as manifestações que aconteceram aqui hoje, nos últimos dias, falam por si só, né? Do motivo de Bianca, eu, Camila, João e tantas outras pessoas que desde 2017 estão se envolvendo e tendo vontade e disposição de fazer isso, fazemos, né? É por isso. Então, eu acho que essa complexidade de mobilidades, né? Essa, às vezes, dificuldade de falar de mobilidades, explica o porquê que é tão importante fazer o que a gente faz, do jeito que a gente está fazendo, com tanta dedicação aqui. Então, obrigado por vocês terem vindo, obrigado por vocês serem tão interessadas, disponíveis. Eu vou fazer alguns anúncios um pouco mais administrativos depois, mas queria agradecer minha parceira. SPMob, né? A gente, cada 2 anos, está aqui. E esperar que a gente possa reproduzir isso sempre, várias vezes, cada vez melhor, cada vez mais bonito, né? Obrigado.